All right, we'll go ahead and get ready to get started with class this morning. I am going to fly in the face of what we've been talking about with all of Solomon's wisdom and do something that's probably unwise. Since I never finished one class in 2 weeks, in one week. I'm going to try to cover two classes this week because I don't like how the book lined things up and that we don't talk a lot about what Solomon did wrong and we focus on what he did right. Whereas with David, we focused a lot on what he did right and wrong. And I think that's important for us to cover. So we're actually going to I'm going to try my hardest to make it through both lesson 12 and 13 in the book today. We probably won't make it all the way through 13, but I won't go, as deep into things as I normally do because some of this will also be a review of what we discussed in detail last week. But so just bear with me as we go through this because we'll be reading a lot of verses and trying to move fairly quickly, but still want you all to make comments and let me know what's on your mind or questions that you have. But as we get started, I wanted to think about a little bit about what we talked about last week with, the Ark of the Covenant moving into the temple, and we left off with like Solomon giving his kind of blessing and his prayer, over the temple. And do we remember like what some of the things that Solomon was saying, as he was doing that from last week? Like, was there anything that stuck out to you all from what we discussed last week as far as what he said as they were moving the ark into the temple? Because, like, to me, it was interesting that he called out, how thankful he was to God and recognizing all the things that he had done for the children of Israel, as well as like just keeping them in mind through all of these things and always sticking with them. Trying to think if there were any other things. I know we talked about how specific some of the measurements and things were, talking about the ark and things in history, but any other thoughts from last week before we get moving? Yeah.
It took a long time for that promise to come about.
Yes.
David was going to do it, but he couldn't do it. So, looking at it that way, that God did fulfill the promise. And I guess for me, I get impatient with God.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's like.
So it's like, come on, I need this now. I don't need it later, or something like that sometimes. And it's, and then I have to back up and say, well, maybe it wasn't the right thing in the first place.
Right. And I think that's very challenging for us to do. And I know we've talked about it in the past of like, especially in the world we live in today where we're so used to everything we do like happening so fast. Like if I order something online and it doesn't get shipped in the 2 days from Amazon, I'm like, what's going on here? It took a third day for you to get me this. Or now Amazon, I'll order something at night and they'll be like, you want me to deliver this at 4 a.m. tomorrow? And I'm like, wow, they can get there that fast. And that's just like what we're used to. And so I think this is good for us to keep in mind with that, like, especially big things like this. It doesn't always have to be big, but like important things like this take time and they're going to happen in their own time, and like God has his plan. So when we pray for things, just because it doesn't happen immediately, it isn't that God isn't answering you. All right, well, we'll get started in 2 Chronicles chapter 7 then. I'm going to, for the sake of time, read the verses today, but we'll look at 2 Chronicles chapter 7, and we'll start in verses 1 through 3 if you want to follow along with me. 2 Chronicles 7, 1 through 3. As soon as Solomon finished his prayer, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. And the priests could not enter the house of the Lord, because the glory of the Lord filled the Lord's house. When all the people of Israel saw the fire come down and the glory of God on the temple, they bowed down with their faces to the ground on the pavement and worshipped and gave thanks to the Lord, saying, "For he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever." So I think, first of all, as we think about what we get from this passage, we see that Solomon finishes up that prayer that we had been talking about from the last chapter, and then fire from heaven comes down and consumes the burnt offering and sacrifices. I guess, can anyone think of other times in the Bible where something similar has happened, where God has sent fire down and consumed either sacrifices or things, or you kind of use this mechanism?
Elijah and Mount Carmel.
Yep. Yeah. So why, if we think about it, like, why might he choose to do, they were already like making the burnt offering and sacrifices, they were already like doing the thanking of God. Why might he choose to do this, like, as Solomon finishes his prayer?
Show his approval and his love.
Okay, that's a good one, to show his approval. Any other thoughts on? Like, the other thing I was thinking as I went through this was just like, also, the whole thing we've been talking about the past couple classes with dedicating the temple is, it needs to stick in people's minds as to how important this is. And like, when God does something that shows how powerful he is or how great he is, like, that makes it stick in people's minds. And you've got witnesses, you've got all these leaders here, you've got all these people who are seeing this, and they're going to remember that and share it with others. So I think that's could potentially be another reason that he does this. I think it's probably mostly to show like his approval of all the things that they've done, but also like when you see God's power, it's a lot harder to deny that he exists, right? Because as I was like reading through and preparing for this, I thought about like, what are the reactions that we might see from people today, which we don't, I'm not aware that God has sent down a consuming fire, in 2024 anywhere, but like, what are reactions today to God's power from people in the world? Like, I guess first, what do we as Christians think about God's power?
Well, I was going to say
Okay.
the world probably tries to explain it away with science.
Yeah. Right. So I think that one, kind of the three things that I come up with as far as like how people explain God's power is like, you can deny either his existence or that like he has, done great things in the past. And we know that it's like different how he interacts with us today versus what he did back then, but he still, keeps the world in order. He created all things. He does answer our prayers. So there's definitely people that actively like deny that's going on. What's another like way? Yeah.
I think that would show a contrast between the power of man and the power of God.
Yeah.
Because they have been thinking they were so powerful in building this beautiful temple and doing all this work, which was a big job.
Yeah.
But then the power of God overshadows that in the end.
Right.
And
But
so it's quite a contrast for the people to see that
Yeah.
God's still in control.
right. So God's in control of the situation, and that makes me think too, like, if they were going to burn all of these offerings and sacrifices, like even just that specific piece of it, which took a lot of coordination, how long would it take to like get all the fires together, like make sure all that, continues like it's supposed to versus God? Like if he had wanted to, he could have just said temple be in existence and it could have been built, right? And so I think that's a good point of like, with him bringing the fire down, it like shows his power and shows how much greater he is than us. So I think that's a good point. And that's kind of one of the other way I think that we can take when we like see God's power in action is we can recognize it, right? We can say like, this is God doing either what he promised he was going to do or doing what he does because he loves me or he loves us. And so, I think the point I was going to make was just that like when we see these great and powerful things, we need to recognize like God has done this, or when we read about them, in the Old or New Testament, recognizing God has done it instead of like trying to deny it or explain it away. And then, the rest of the verses we just read kind of cover, we talked about last week how, the presence of God was so great that like the priests couldn't do what they were there to do because he was in the temple and it filled it up. And then the end of verse 1, reiterates this continuing to happen, that the glory of the Lord filled the temple and the priests could not even enter the house of the Lord anymore because the glory of the Lord filled the Lord's house. And I think that just like drives home the point of like how great God is, and that like if his presence is truly there, that like they couldn't even be in the same place because his glory filled the house. And then, kind of finishing out that point of recognizing God's power, what is the reaction that they have in verse 3 when they see this event take place?
Praise him.
Yeah, they bow down on their faces and they praise him, right? And when we think about like people throughout the Old and the New Testament, when they see the power of God, or when they see like when they recognize who Jesus is, or even like when angels come to them, how do people typically react once they like understand what's going on? They do something like this, right? Where they like realize that they're in the presence of greatness, and they respond to that. And I think that it's, like I mentioned, slightly different for us today because we don't have these specific types of things happening in front of our faces today, but we can still embody this attitude and humility towards God, recognizing that He has created all things, that He takes care of us, and still show this thanksgiving and this praise and this humility towards Him in our lives today. And I think that's why it's so important that we go back and we study things from the Old Testament to see how much He guided His people and took care of His people, because it's very easy, even for them in the moment back then, to not recognize what all He's doing for them. And we have that same thing today, right? Where we might think, for the point that was made earlier, I'm praying for this, God isn't doing this thing. It's a lot easier when you look back on your life to see where God has helped you and helped navigate you through things than it is in the moment when you're struggling with something. So I think that's why it's good for us to go back and study these things. Any other thoughts before we move on to verses 4 through 11? All right, let's read verses 4 through 11 together. Then the king and all the people offered sacrifice before the Lord. King Solomon offered as a sacrifice 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep. So the king and all the people dedicated the house of God. The priests stood at their posts, the Levites also, with the instruments for music to the Lord that King David had made, for giving thanks to the Lord. For His steadfast love endures forever. Whenever David offered praises by their ministry, opposite them the priests sounded trumpets, and all Israel stood. And Solomon consecrated the middle of the court that was before the house of the Lord, for there he offered the burnt offering and the fat of the peace offerings, because the bronze altar Solomon had made could not hold the burnt offering and the grain offering and the fat. At that time Solomon held the feast for 7 days, and Israel with him, a very great assembly, from Lebo Hamath to the brook of Egypt. And on the 8th day they held a solemn assembly, for they had kept the dedication of the altar 7 days, and the feast 7 days. On the 23rd day of the 7th month he sent the people away to their homes, joyful and glad of heart for the prosperity that the Lord had granted to David and to Solomon and to Israel His people. Thus Solomon finished the house of the Lord and the king's house, all that Solomon had planned to do in the house of the Lord and in his own house, he successfully accomplished. So we got a lot of things going on here as we look at these verses. What was this is kind of a basic question, but what was the point, we keep talking about these sacrifices to God. What was the point of these sacrifices in the Old Testament? There's a couple different things sacrifices were for, but why did they?
Sins.
Okay, so they offered sacrifices for their sins. Why are they offering them on this occasion, which we already kind of hit on, but why are they offering so many things here?
Praise.
Praise. They're recognizing God's glory. And just think about for a second, the king, all these people offering sacrifices, and then we're given specific numbers here. We've talked about how before when we're given specific numbers, oftentimes that means, we should pause and think about them and the magnitude of this. Think about 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep. Just how much, even if they're all crammed together, touching each other, how much space that would take up, and coordination even just to have all those animals in the same place. And then we go on to think about okay, so we've got to do all the things that go into this process of being a sacrifice, right? You've got to actually kill the animals, and you've got to clean them up, and you've got to do all the things that were called out in the Old Testament. And so this wasn't just something that, I think sometimes it's easy or for me to look back when I think about the sacrifices of the Old Testament, like when people offered them for themselves or their families when they sinned, it's like, oh, you're just thinking about this one animal, and I don't even think about like all the things that go into the prep for that. But you're like, that's not that big of a deal. But they were like offering a lot to God here, and I think that that should inspire us to like, be motivated, like to make sacrifices in our lives, right? Like this wasn't just, I've got all these, animals over here. This was an actual sacrifice, and the importance of this wasn't just that it was like coming out of their abundance. While King Solomon had a lot, this took a lot of energy and effort, and I think that that's important for us to like remember today in our lives. We're not sacrificing animals today, but we make sacrifices to God, both in our worship and coming and being focused with our hearts, from the praise aspect, but also in our finances and what we're able to do for God to help other people. We should be making sacrifices. So I think as we talk about like all of these sacrifices people made to God, let's think about how that applies to us as well and how great of an event this was. And then we kind of go through some more verses here talking about, the process that the Levites went through, playing the instruments, of worshiping God, and we even kind of hit on that last week of how, like, trumpets come across and how loud this would have been and how much significance this would have had. But then we even get to the point where, like, in verse 7, thinking about the sacrifices again, where it says, "And Solomon consecrated the middle of the court that was before the house of the Lord, and there he offered the burnt offering and the fat offerings of peace. But the bronze altar Solomon had made could not hold the burnt offering and the grain offering and the fat." They had so much going on that the altars that had been built couldn't even handle everything that they had going. And I think this represents for us, like, trying to embody when we, like, think about the great things that God has done for us, like, overflowing our cup of like what we can do as far as giving and like thanking him. We should be embodying the same mentality. So I think that's also an important parallel that we can draw here as far as showing our thankfulness to God. It's just making sure that we, especially when he does things for us or we recognize that he's done things for us, being so thankful, that we even like overfill the altar of our worship today. And then we kind of see the last chunk of this part is just talking about all the people who stayed for so many days and then went back to their own places joyful and glad of heart. And I think that's important for us to take away from this passage as well, is like when we have, great events in our lives or great events at this church or in the church in general, we can be encouraged by that, and we can take that back, to our families, or if we like happen to go to like a church somewhere else that's doing something really encouraging, like bring that back here, because we should be joyful and glad in our hearts. This was a momentous occasion for them, the dedicating of the temple. This was a huge turning point for Israel, and they were all energized and excited by it. And so they left joyful, and we should attempt to do the same thing. All right, any other thoughts before we read the last chunk here? Yeah.
I think another thing too, people should, of course, we know and the people back then didn't, but this is a precursor to the one Lamb that saved the world.
Yes. Yeah.
And that was Christ. So, all the animals don't necessarily save, but Christ did.
Right.
With his sacrifice for us.
Yes. To have that perfect sacrifice that isn't just like rolling the sins forward, it's an amazing thing. And just from the practical sense of, I'm glad I don't have to go and offer all these sacrifices and, remember all the new law is so much better because we don't have to remember all of those very specific things that we have to do, so there's just so many things that make it better. Yeah.
Right, and Christ himself said too that all of their rules and their orders and how to do stuff didn't bring them forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
It was more for the priests to show off and everything else. So Christ made the one sacrifice that all should believe in and be thankful for.
Right. And we'll hopefully get some time to focus on this a little bit next week, but it's like just thinking about how great this whole process is, it still doesn't compare to what we have in the church. Even if you think about the temple, right? This building is not gold plated, and we don't have, monuments up here and different things like that, but we are so much, I guess this might be a weird way to say this, but we're very much blessed in a, not different, but we are very much blessed because of that sacrifice that we have and what we have the ability to do and focus on, and, share God's love and the gospel with everyone. So I think it's a really good point. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
The numbers just always blow my mind when you think about all the numbers. I mean, all the numbers of the people that were there, all the time. I mean, I always think about Camp Randall on football Saturday, how, and like that's 100,000 people, you'd say, and that it's like there were so many more than that, and there's just people everywhere down there,
Well,
and if you think about how many people there were, and then like the animals, 122,000 sheep. I mean, wow, that's a lot of sheep.
yeah. Yeah. Generally, for Camp Randall, people are, you got to worry about where to park your car or whatever, maybe. But like, you're not like, oh, did I bring donkeys or animals with me, or like all these things. Your car can stay stationary. You don't have to think about it as much once you parked it. But there's just so much logistically that would have to go on here. And like we've talked about in previous classes, like feeding all of these people, like making sure, because they stayed. We kind of glossed over this, but they stayed like for multiple days, so they needed places to stay if they weren't from around, that area specifically. So like there was a lot of logistical stuff that had to be thought of and covered here. And I think it's important, we've moved kind of fast through this, but I would encourage you all to go back and just read through and think, meditate on like how momentous this occasion just really was, because I think it's hard for us to take in the short time that we have here. Any other thoughts? All right, let's read through the end of the chapter, I think. Yeah, we'll go through verse 22. So verses 12 through 22 together. 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verses 12 through 22. Then the Lord appeared to Solomon in the night and said to him, I have heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a house of sacrifice. When I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or command the locusts to devour the land, or send pestilence among my people, if my people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sins and heal their land. Now my eyes will be open and my ears attentive to the prayer that is made in this place. For now I have chosen and consecrated this house, that my name may be there forever. For my eyes and my heart will be there for all time. And as for you, if you will walk before me, as David your father walked, doing according to all that I have commanded you, and keeping my statutes and my rules, then I will establish your royal throne, as I covenanted with David your father, saying, you shall not lack a man to rule Israel. But if you turn aside and forsake my statutes and my commandments that I have set before you, and go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will pluck you up from my land that I have given you, and this house that I have consecrated for my name. I will cast out of my sight, and I will make it a proverb and a byword among all people. And at this house, which was exalted, everyone passing by will be astonished and say, why has the Lord done thus to this land and to this house? Then they will say, because they abandoned the Lord their God of their fathers, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, and laid hold on other gods, and worshipped them and served them. Therefore he has brought all this disaster on them. So this is where, we're coming down from all the process, right? We read in verse 11 how Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord, finished building the king's house, and we mentioned all the help that he had and the planning that went into that. But this is done now. So they've accomplished this mission, and it's kind of like, what's next? What comes next after this? And I think, we aren't told in this chapter directly, like, what specific things if God wants Solomon to do or things like that. But I think there's a lot that we can take to heart of, this passage. And the first part, in verse 12 and following is like kind of getting back to a point that we've already discussed this morning is God does hear our prayers. We don't typically get like this direct of a response or anything today when we pray. But we see here that the Lord appeared to Solomon in the night and said to him, I have heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a house of sacrifice. So this kind of cements this occasion as far as like God is happy with what they've done. They've done what they were commanded to do. And so, he's saying this is good in my eyes here. But he goes on in these next verses through the end of the chapter to talk about some things that we know that's going to happen to Israel, right? They are going to turn away from God at various points and be punished for that in various ways. But he gives some basic things that I think are, important for us to remember in that there are going to be, first of all, in verse 13, there are going to be times when, things are not going well. And what does verse 14 say that God's people are supposed to do when things are not going well, when they've turned away? What are they back then as well as us supposed to do in verse 14?
Right.
So they're supposed to pray, humble themselves, right, and turn away from their wicked ways. So how do we recognize that we're in this spot in our lives? Because I think, when we look at verse 13, like there's some very specific things that are called out there as far as like how God used to show his displeasure with the Israelites, right? Like there would be no rain, or there would be plagues or pestilence, or they might be taken over, in Babylonian captivity or various captivity. That is, I've not directly seen that happen in my life as far as like, I'm taken off into captivity or whatever. How do we recognize when we're in this point where we need to turn away from our wicked ways? Yeah.
Well, other Christians can help you see.
Yep. Yeah. Other people can point it out, and there's whole entire sermons and passages and classes on like the right and wrong ways to go about that. But I think that's a good point of like, part of us coming here to encourage one another is recognizing how we're doing and, trying to help others grow to love the Lord and turn away from their wicked ways, just like we would hopefully want somebody to do that to us. What are other ways that we can recognize?
I think as a country today, we're very close to the precipice here and looking at, it's time that we that this country turns away from some of the evil ways and turns back more toward God. And we don't know what his punishment will be, but I think it's probably coming.
Yeah. And I think it can also feel not hopeless, but like slightly discouraging, I guess, when we as Christians might find ourselves like in a country or in a place, whatever level we want to call it out at, whether it's locally at a country level or the world as a whole, like where, people aren't focused on God and focused on doing what they're supposed to. But I think that's another opportunity for us to look back through the Old Testament and see how many of the prophets had to deal with this when like nobody was following God, or like, oh, it was just a small group of people following God. And so I think we can look back and see a lot of examples of that and how, God still took care of whether it was a small group of people who was following him, whether it was one person that was following him, or as a whole nation, right? He makes these covenants with the people of Israel. He's told us what we need to do in the New Testament, and if we do what we're supposed to, ultimately he's going to take care of us. But yeah, I agree. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to do our best, even if we feel like it's a discouraging situation to change.
Individuals still have, and we can, as you said, look at those examples. Through the captivity, there were those that just kept saying, we can't do this, you can't do this, but they were rescued in one way or another.
Right. And like
And
we,
some even prosper because they stayed with God's word and did what God wanted them to do.
and I think we had a responsibility to at least do what we can in our sphere of influence. And some of us have smaller spheres of influence, and some of us have larger spheres of influence. But you may just have one really close friend that you can like help with whatever the situation might be, or you might have a position of authority where you can influence more people. And I think it's on all of us based on what resources we have and what talents we're given to use those to try to move things in the right direction. So I think that's a really, really good point to keep in mind. And then how do we like, so we can, recognize that we're going down this path. We've talked about some ways that we can like help other people out of this situation. What about if it's like something going on for ourselves where we've recognized that we're doing something wrong, we are heading down the wicked path? How do we, follow this process of like turning back to God today? Yeah.
Surround ourselves by Christian people
Mm-hmm.
and people with good morals and good values.
Yeah. Because, we've talked a lot about for both David and Solomon and the positions they're in, but it happens with us too of like, when we mess up, we almost want to like close ourselves off and not let people see that we're like struggling with whatever the thing might be. And oftentimes that's one of the worst things that we can do is to like pull ourselves away, or even worse than pulling ourselves away, in my opinion, is when we just like hide it completely from people. So we still show up to church, we still, from an outward appearance, are doing all the things that make us look okay. So nobody's even asking questions, and then we don't ever, we just rationalize whatever wicked thing might be going on in our lives, and we never have any motivation to change it. Because it's hard to make changes, and it's hard to admit to those around us that we love, that expect better of us, that like we've done these things, but it's an important process that, we're all going to experience. Yeah.
I think there's one thing that you have to remember. It's not like when we normally talk that we made a mistake, it's like, this is a biggie, what we would call a biggie.
Yeah.
Okay? But all of us are on this continuous path to try to get better. So some of us start off where we're doing something bad every hour. Then we get better, we're only doing it once a day.
Yeah.
Then maybe once a week and once a month. But the point of it is, we're still messing up. We're still falling short. So we shouldn't allow ourselves to become arrogant to say that I'm past this. We always have to be examining ourselves. We always have to realize that getting to heaven is only by the mercy of God. We can't get there on our own.
Yeah.
So, and I've always said, Christianity is a team sport. I need you, you need me to get through this life so that we can get to heaven.
Yeah, that makes me think about a conversation Shelby and I were having on the walk last week, where we were talking about like when you actually become an adult and like have life figured out. And I think the answer is like that never really happens, right? And that like applies. We talk about it in a spiritual sense too, of like you never get to the point where you're just like, I am this old or this mature as a Christian, I never make mistakes. It's easy for me to like look to people who are older and more mature than me and say like, well, I never see that person mess up, but there's still like struggles going on. But the goal is those are becoming fewer and farther between, and we're learning and maturing and learning how to deal with those situations. So yeah, Olivia.
Something you said made me think of this, that part of stumbling less frequently can be helped a lot by removing the things that you stumble over.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're realizing or somebody points out that you're doing something that you shouldn't be doing or whatever it may be, if you're continuing to surround yourself with people, things, music, art, clothes, whatever, that lend to those kind of mistakes, then it's way more likely that you're going to keep falling into it. So the best thing that you can do is to the best of your ability, remove it from your life.
And like that's what, hopefully we'll have some time to look at next week, even as far as like with Solomon, like things were going so well for him and we see all these things happening, and then he brings stumbling blocks into his own life which is what leads him away. And like, you know, being confronted about some of those things, like, doesn't it change what he's doing and remove those stumbling blocks? And so that's just, you know, setting yourself up for failure. I think, Bill, did you have something? Or?
Well, from what I take what you've been saying, that we can't, we probably won't ever be able to walk up to Jesus and tell him, well, move over, as good as you are.
Yeah. I mean, that's true, right? Like, and I think we have to balance the, like, striving for that, right? We want to get as close to that as we can, but knowing, like, we're never going to be perfect, but, you know, we have that example that we can look to and make sure that we don't ever get so arrogant that we're saying that exact statement of, like, oh, you know, I'm just good. Yeah.
Well, you know, we all know that we're told in Scripture as an ongoing process that we're to confess and repent whenever we get to these on a regular basis, daily basis. What we, I think, sometimes forget is that when we do that, it completely disarms the gossip and the, you know, people looking down on you, and it gets everything out in the open, so that it then becomes between you and God again.
Yeah.
You know, you don't have to worry about what other people think or what they're going to say, because it's out in the open, and you kind of spilled the beans on yourself. And you know, being in a different work situation for the last year or so than I have been for a long time, I've learned that, you know, if you make a mistake and you immediately own it, it's like, oh, okay. You know, because so many people are saying, well, I didn't do that, or I didn't mess up. It's never their fault. At least where I'm at, is, you know, that happens a lot. So, but when you own your mistakes and you confess that you've messed up, it completely disarms, and they can't really help but go, okay, and then go on about your day and about your business. So right. I think it works that way on a bigger sin, as he was kind of talking about over there, big quote, air quotes, bigger sin kind of situation.
Yeah, and I think that's, like, brings up a good thought in my mind of, like, a lot of things, both spiritual and not spiritual. Like, we get the discipline to do the things of, like, mentioning these things more publicly or whatever by, like, actually doing them and practicing doing that, right? Like, if I go for years, keep making mistakes, and I'm always the type of person who, like, hides it or tries to cover it up, I'm never going to get better at, like, sharing what I do wrong with other people, because I'm not, like, practicing how to, like, do that. So it's only going to get harder the longer you, like, close yourself up and don't, like, share that with other people. So I think that's, you know, a good thing. And then it also will encourage other people, seeing us be willing to talk about our faults and things. Yeah.
It's also important to be someone who is a good receiver of admission of sin.
Mm-hmm.
If someone is punished, if someone feels like they're being punished for being open about their mistakes, they're very much less likely to admit their mistakes the next time.
Yeah.
And
Go ahead.
Just when someone comes to you with an admission of sin and admission of guilt, it's not because they're looking for you to pinpoint exactly what they've done wrong and why it's wrong what they've done. If they're coming to you telling you that they've messed up, they know they've messed up, they know how they've messed up.
Mm-hmm.
And it isn't your job to tell them, oh, well, this is the bad thing you did. It's also not your job to tell them, well, it's not that bad. Your job is to help them through that. Okay, how, like we talked about, how could you not stumble on that in the future? Like, what are some ways that either they can think of or that you can think of to help them get over that in the future?
Yeah. I think those are good points for us to consider as we think about, like, how we interact with people, right? Because if we make them feel, if it's not the problem between them and God that's making them, like, change, and it's, like, because of how they're worried about how, like, we're going to react or whatever, that's not the right way for that process to work either. So we have to make sure that we're not doing the, like, gossiping or, like, talking about, like, oh, I can't believe that they did this, or what else have they done, you know, and be very careful about that, because that can be tempting. Because a lot of times, if I'm the type of person who is not good at, like, doing that and admitting when I'm wrong, then my natural reaction is when I see it in someone else, I want to go talk to everybody else about how, like, oh, look at how bad they are, because that, in my mind, makes me look better, which is not true. But, I think we can, like, fall into these temptations and traps, and then I think we can take this out to a larger scale, as we think about, like, what they were facing here. I know I've kind of co-opted thinking about, Solomon and different leaders of Israel, thinking about leading the nation in the right direction. Kind of, we've been focused more on personal stuff, but I think we can take it a step back from here and think about, like, the Four Lakes Church collectively, right? Like, we also, if we as people are doing the right thing, hopefully that helps us to go in the right direction, but we also need to, like, assess every so often, like, are we collectively as a congregation, like, headed in the right direction, make sure that we aren't doing wicked things or, like, too focused on ourselves, and, like, thinking about that. So I think that's, another thing we can keep in mind as we think about these last couple verses as well, is, like, this doesn't just apply to us personally, it is kind of how we're headed as a group of Christians. So we talked about how, we and them are supposed to be humble, admit our wicked ways, but I think the kind of back part of this passage is just God laying out, like, here's how this is going to work. If you do what I told you to do, if you follow, in the footsteps of David when he's talking to Solomon here, then I'm going to take care of you, essentially paraphrasing heavily here. But if you go against my laws, if you go against my commandments, then things are not going to go well for you. You're going to be punished. And we are given different, punishments or benefits than they were directly receiving there, but it kind of works the same for us, right? We're told throughout the New Testament how we're supposed to behave, what we're supposed to do, using Jesus as our example. And we know, we are told what the punishment is, and we are, told what the reward is if we do what God tells us to do. So I think it's important, in this chunk of scripture, and this is not the only place in the Old or the New Testament that this happens, but if we compare what, other religions, especially in the Old Testament world, like, thought about their gods, like, a lot of times they were like, I'm going to try this sacrifice because I don't know if this is going to please this God or whatever. I'm going to do this specific thing because I don't know the outcome. God doesn't ever leave us at a point where we're like, I don't know what the rules are. I don't know what to expect, right? Like, he regularly tells us, if you do this, I will be happy with you. If you don't do this, I'm going to be upset with you. So I think that's important for us to glean from this passage as well, is he lays that out. Now, with this being laid out, do the people of Israel stick to it? They say, we understand, we're not going to make any more mistakes? Or what do they do from here that we know from the rest of the Old Testament?
And they say they're not going to do it, but they do it anyway.
Yes.
And I mean, even Paul says, the things I want to do, sometimes I don't do.
Right.
So we all run into that. But they made many mistakes, and it came upon them, just like God said, I'm going to tear this house down, and people are going to laugh when they go by it. And it happened.
Yeah.
Because they left him.
Right.
For
Yeah.
other guys.
And, like, I think it's an important thing, just like part of the point of all of this that we've been talking about, the temple, is for this to stick in people's minds, to both stick in Solomon's mind and the people who have seen all these great events. Like, let's not ourselves, to what you're mentioning, forget, like, this is the same God that we serve today, who has made similar promises or the same promises to us. And so he is ultimately going to do what he tells us he's going to do, right? If there are people who say, like, oh, God's a loving God, he would never punish us, it's like, no, he's told us what he's going to do if we don't do what he says. So we need to, like, remember that, because I think sometimes it's easy for us to, like, not have, these types of things in the forefront of our mind and rationalize things. So it's important for us to, keep the promises that he's made to us, both good and bad, in our mind. Any other thoughts on just generally what we've discussed today? Yeah.
I think it's also important to actually know the rules. You probably have to read the Bible, more
Yeah.
than likely.
Yeah, if you don't know the rules, then you can't follow them. So that's a good point. And one minute.
Well, I'm just going to say, so often we think we'll do this and nobody's going to know about it. God's all seeing and God's all knowing. God already knows it.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's so many ways, even in my own life, that in the past I have rationalized different things that I have done as far as like, well, it's not hurting anybody else, or like, nobody else knows about this, or whatever the way I might rationalize it. But like, ultimately, even if I was the only human on the face of the planet, like, God knows what I'm doing, and it is still affecting my relationship with Him. So, yeah.
I know in my life, personally, if I've had a problem with certain sin, and I may go 6 months or a year without having that sin.
Mm-hmm.
But when I notice if I ever become not thankful for that in my prayers to God, that's when that sin will slip back in.
Yeah.
So if I'm constantly praying and saying, thank you for this, thank you for that, and also noting that other sin, that sin has not crept back in.
Mm-hmm.
But if I ever go a period of time, I can see it try to come back in, then I better be praying quick,
Right.
or it'll be there.
Yeah, yeah, and like, because there's a lot of different things that we all personally struggle with, different levels, and there are some things that we really struggle with that when we let our guard down, even for it can be as small as days or hours. If we let our guard down, then it's going to like slip back in. We can think about the addictions that people even just have physically, right? Like there are people who have given up like alcohol or cigarettes or whatever the thing might be that's addicting, that they haven't done that thing for 20 years, but there are even still certain triggers that can lead them to go back to whatever that thing is that has influenced their past life. And that's how sin works for us, right? It's like a lot of things that we do that are sinful are pleasurable, right? And whether it's physically or just how it affects our status or whatever, we enjoy the outcome in the moment, and so it's very easy to fall back into that. So, yeah.
Well, it's just because you don't see Satan sitting over here, doesn't mean he ain't there.
Right.
He's there, he's just waiting, gotcha.
And he's waiting for those. He's focused on. He's probably more focused on other people when we're in our strong moments, but that time that we let our guard down, when we're not thinking about things, is when he's ready to count. He doesn't get tired. He's not sitting, over there sleeping like.
Yeah, he doesn't take rest breaks like we need to.
Right. I think in the same thing about what Lonnie just said about God being aware of like all the things that we're doing. Satan also is ready at all times to pounce on any of our weaknesses. Any other thoughts before we close? All right. I wasn't successful in getting to the next lesson, which I didn't figure I would be. But if I think what would help, because I do want to take a little bit of time next week to cover we'll cover chapter 9 and probably one other chapter. So if you want to take some time this week to read 2 Chronicles chapter 9, just because we'll probably move a little bit faster through that, and we can compare. It talks about like the fame and the glory that came to Solomon because of what all he had, and we'll compare like how good things could have been if he hadn't done some of the other stuff. So I'd appreciate it if you take some time to read 2 Chronicles 9 before next week. All right, we can be done with that. Thanks for everybody's comments.